In 1798, President John Adams and the Federalist-controlled Congress passed a series of laws that would become some of the most controversial in U.S. history, the Alien and Sedition Acts. These laws were designed to protect the United States from foreign influence and internal dissent during a period of heightened tensions with France. However, the Sedition Act in particular was seen as a direct assault on the freedom of speech and press, leading to widespread political backlash and contributing to the downfall of the Federalist Party. This video explores the context of the Alien and Sedition Acts, their impact on American politics, and the lessons they offer about government overreach and civil liberties. The 1790s were a decade of political division in the United States, as the new nation struggled to find its identity in the wake of the American Revolution. The Federalist Party, led by President John Adams and figures like Alexander Hamilton, favored a strong central government and close ties with Britain. On the other side were the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who supported a more decentralized government and were more sympathetic to revolutionary France. At the center of these political battles was the ongoing conflict between Britain and France, known as the Napoleonic Wars. While the United States tried to remain neutral, both European powers interfered with American shipping and relations with France deteriorated, leading to the undeclared naval conflict known as the Quasi-War. Within this context, the Federalists feared the influence of French revolutionaries and their sympathizers within the United States. Many Federalists believed that immigrants, particularly those from France and Ireland, were disloyal and posed a threat to national security. These concerns laid the groundwork for the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts were composed of three separate laws, each aimed at curbing the influence of foreign nationals in the United States. The first, the Naturalization Act, increased the residency requirement for immigrants to become U.S. citizens from 5 to 14 years. This was a direct attack on the immigrant communities who tended to support the Democratic Republicans and delayed their ability to vote. The second law, the Alien Friends Act, gave the president the authority to deport any non-citizen deemed dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. The third, the Alien Enemies Act, allowed the president to deport or imprison non-citizens from a hostile nation during times of war. These laws gave the executive branch sweeping powers over immigrants, and while no one was deported under the Alien Friends Act, the mere existence of the law created a climate of fear and suspicion. Many immigrants, particularly those from France and Ireland, felt targeted by the legislation, which contributed to rising tensions between political parties. The most controversial of the Alien and Sedition Acts was the Sedition Act, passed on July 14, 1798. The Sedition Act made it a crime to write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government, Congress, or the president. The Federalists argued that the Sedition Act was necessary to protect the country from internal dissent during a time of international crisis. They believed that extreme political criticism, particularly from Democratic Republican newspapers, was undermining the government's authority and weakening the nation in the face of the threat from France. However, to the Democratic Republicans, the Sedition Act was nothing less than the attack on the First Amendment. It was seen as an attempt to silence legitimate political opposition and a violation of the fundamental freedoms of speech and the press. The Sedition Act had an immediate and chilling effect on political discourse in the United States. Several prominent Democratic Republican newspaper editors were arrested and prosecuted under the law. One of the most high-profile cases was that of Benjamin Franklin Bach, the grandson of Benjamin Franklin and editor of the Aurora, a newspaper that had been sharply critical of President Adams. Bach was charged with libel under the Sedition Act, but died of yellow fever before his trial could take place. Another significant case involved Matthew Lyon, a Democratic Republican congressman from Vermont. Lyon was convicted under the Sedition Act for publishing letters that criticized President Adams. He was sentenced to 4 months in prison and a $1,000 fine, making him the first sitting member of Congress to be imprisoned under the law. Despite being in prison, Lyon was re-elected to Congress while still behind bars, a sign of the growing public opposition to the Sedition Act. In total, around 25 individuals were prosecuted under the Sedition Act, most of them journalists or political figures aligned with the Democratic Republicans. The Federalist government's crackdown on political dissent only served to galvanize the Democratic Republicans and deepen the political divide in the country. The Alien and Sedition Acts sparked a constitutional crisis and led to one of the most important political responses in American history, the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. These resolutions were written secretly by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and passed by the legislatures of Virginia and Kentucky in 1798 and 1799. The Virginia and Kentucky Resolution argued that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional and that the states had the right to nullify federal laws that overstepped the powers granted to the federal government by the Constitution. This doctrine of states' rights would become a central issue in American political thought and would later be invoked in debates over slavery, tariffs, and secession. While the resolutions did not lead to immediate changes in federal law, they laid the groundwork for future resistance to perceived government overreach and helped to solidify the Democratic-Republican opposition to the Federalist Party. President John Adams, although often seen as the architect of the Alien and Sedition Acts, was more conflicted about their implementation than some of his Federalist colleagues. Adams believed that the country was facing a real threat from French agents and that the acts were necessary to protect national security. However, Adams was not as enthusiastic about the Sedition Act as some of his more radical Federalist allies, like Alexander Hamilton, who saw the law as an opportunity to crush political opposition. Adams rarely used the full extent of the powers granted to him under the Alien Acts, and he later expressed regret about the Sedition Act. In his letters after leaving office, Adams acknowledged that the law had been misused to target political opponents and that it had contributed to his defeat in the 1800 presidential election. The Alien and Sedition Acts played a central role in the presidential election of 1800, one of the most bitter and divisive elections in American history. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, used the acts as evidence of the Federalist tyranny and overreach, arguing that the Federalists were undermining the principles of the American Revolution. The Federalists, in turn, accused the Democratic Republicans of being too sympathetic to revolutionary France and of encouraging sedition within the United States. The election ultimately resulted in a victory for Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, marking the first peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another in the U.S. history. Jefferson's victory was seen as a repudiation of the Alien and Sedition Acts, and one of his first acts as president was to pardon those who had been convicted under the act. The Federalist Party, weakened by the political fallout from the Alien and Sedition Acts and the election of 1800, would never again dominate American politics. The Alien and Sedition Acts remain some of the most controversial laws in all of American history, and they are often cited as one of the earliest examples of government overreach in the name of national security. The acts also highlighted the deep political divisions within the young republic and the ongoing struggle to define the limits of federal power. While the laws were eventually repealed or allowed to expire, their legacy continues to be felt in American political and legal thought. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, in particular, laid the groundwork for the doctrine of nullification and the states' rights, which later became a central issue in the debates over slavery and secession in the 19th century. The Alien and Sedition Acts also serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of using national security as a justification for curbing civil liberties. Throughout American history, there have been other instances where the government has restricted free speech or other rights in the name of national security, such as during World War I with the Espionage and Sedition Acts, or during the Red Scare of the 1950s. In each case, the balance between security and liberty has been a central issue, and the Alien and Sedition Acts continue to be a reference point in those debates. John Adams' presidency was deeply shaped by the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. While Adams and the Federalists saw these laws as necessary to protect the nation from foreign influence and internal dissent, they quickly became a symbol of government overreach and an attack of constitutional rights of freedom, speech, and press. The political backlash against the acts helped to unify the Democratic Republican opposition and contributed to Adams' defeat in the 1800 election. To this day, the Alien and Sedition Acts remain a significant chapter in American history, offering important lessons about the limits of government power and the protection of civil liberties.